At my husband's funeral, I realized I had already been erased. The words didn't come out of my mouth, but they settled somewhere deep in my chest the moment I stepped into the chapel and saw the program resting on every seat, printed in soft cream paper with delicate black lettering, the kind my husband, Thomas, would have appreciated for its simplicity and dignity. And yet as I picked one up with hands that felt steadier than they should have been, I noticed something small, almost invisible to anyone else, but impossible for me to ignore. His name was there, of course, Thomas Edward Whitmore, beloved father, devoted grandfather. And beneath it, a short paragraph about his life, his career, his kindness, but nowhere, not once, was there any mention of his wife of 42 years. Nowhere was my name, Evelyn Whitmore, printed beside the man I had shared a home with for over 4 decades. And for a moment, I simply stood there, holding that program, feeling the quiet hum of conversation around me as guests began to arrive, the faint scent of lilies filling the air, and I told myself it must have been an oversight, something small, something unintentional, because grief makes people careless, doesn't it? But then I looked up and saw Vanessa standing near the front, dressed in a perfectly tailored black dress, her posture straight, her expression carefully composed, greeting guests as if she were the one who had lost the center of her world. And beside her stood my son, Daniel, nodding politely, shaking hands, thanking people for coming, and neither of them looked toward me, not even once, as I made my way down the aisle, my heels clicking softly against the polished floor, each step measured, controlled, the way Thomas used to tell me I carried myself. Grace under pressure, he would say with a smile, and I held on to that now. Even as I reached the front rows and realized my seat wasn't where it had always been during family gatherings, not beside my husband, not even near the casket, but a few rows back, slightly off, to the side, as if I were a distant relative, someone included out of obligation rather than belonging, and I paused for just a second, just long enough to notice that the front row was already arranged, Vanessa seated closest to the aisle, Daniel beside her, their children next, forming a neat, curated image of a grieving family. And I understood then that nothing about this was accidental, not the missing name, not the seating, not the way Vanessa's hand rested lightly on Daniel's arm as guests approached, accepting condolences that should have been mine as much as theirs, and still, I didn't say a word. I adjusted the sleeve of my black coat, the one Thomas had bought me last winter during a trip to Boston, and I moved quietly into the seat that had been left for me, folding my hands in my lap, the program still resting between my fingers, as if I could smooth the paper and somehow find my name hidden there after all. And as the room continued to fill, I listened, not to the speeches or the music that hadn't yet begun, but to the conversations drifting through the air, soft murmurs of sympathy, fragments of sentences that painted a picture I hadn't agreed to be part of. Vanessa has been so strong through all of this. Someone whispered behind me. She handled everything beautifully. Another voice added, and I felt a strange stillness settle over me, not the kind that comes from shock, but the kind that comes from understanding, because strength, apparently, had a new definition today, one that didn't include the woman who had sat beside Thomas through every doctor's appointment, every sleepless night, every quiet morning with coffee shared across the kitchen table, and I lowered my gaze to the program, once more, tracing the edge of the paper with my thumb. And that's when I noticed something else, a detail so subtle it could have been dismissed if I hadn't been paying attention, a small line at the bottom, arrangements coordinated by Daniel and Vanessa Whitmore. No mention of me there either, and for the first time that morning, a thought formed clearly, sharp and undeniable. This wasn't just grief making people careless. This was something deliberate, something planned, and as I sat there, in that quiet, crowded room, surrounded by people who believed they were witnessing a family united in loss, I realized that what I was actually witnessing was something else entirely, something colder, something calculated, and somewhere near the front, Vanessa leaned in to speak to Daniel, her voice low, her expression composed, and though I couldn't hear her words, I didn't need to, because I could already see the shape of what was unfolding, and I understood, with a clarity that surprised even me, that my husband's funeral was not just a goodbye, it was a beginning, just not the one they thought it would be. I did not cry when the service began, not when the soft organ music filled the chapel, Not when the pastor spoke about Thomas as if he had only ever existed in the roles they chose to remember for him. A devoted father, a respected businessman, a generous friend, each word carefully placed like flowers arranged for display, and I sat there with my hands folded neatly in my lap, my back straight, my breathing steady, listening as strangers nodded and murmured in agreement, as if they knew the man I had shared a bed with for over 40 years, as if they had been there for the quiet evenings when he would fall asleep in his armchair with a book resting on his chest, or the mornings when he would insist on making coffee even though he always brewed it too strong. And I realized then that grief, at least the kind people were willing to witness, was a performance, one that Vanessa understood perfectly, because when her turn came to speak, she rose with just the right amount of hesitation, pausing as though gathering strength, her hand briefly touching Daniel's shoulder before she stepped toward the podium, and her voice, when it came, was soft and controlled, carrying easily through the room as she spoke about Thomas with a familiarity that felt almost rehearsed. She talked about his guidance, his wisdom, the way he had welcomed her into the family, and I watched her carefully, not with anger, not yet, but with a kind of quiet attention I had learned over years of observing. Small changes in people, the kind that reveal more than words ever do, and I noticed how she never once looked in my direction, how she spoke as though the story of his life could be told without me in it, and when she finished, there was a gentle wave of applause, the kind reserved for something respectful, but not quite heartfelt, and she returned to her seat beside Daniel, her expression composed, her eyes dry, and for a brief moment, our gazes almost met. But she looked away first, turning instead to whisper something to him, something that made him nod quickly, his jaw tightening just slightly, and that was when I saw it again, that same quiet coordination between them, the kind that does not come from shared grief, but from shared intention. And as the service continued, I became aware of how often people approached them instead of me, offering condolences, placing a hand on Vanessa's arm, telling her how strong she was, how lucky Thomas had been to have her, and each time, she accepted it with a small, grateful smile, her head tilting just enough to suggest humility, and I wondered if anyone noticed how easily she stepped into a role that had not belonged to her, or if I was the only one who could see the difference between what was real and what was being carefully constructed in front of us. And I might have remained in that quiet observation if not for a single sentence that drifted back to me from the row ahead. Two men, speaking in low voices, unaware that I was listening. They are planning to move quickly after this, one of them said. I heard the house is already being evaluated, and the other responded with a soft hum of agreement. Makes sense, easier to handle everything at once. And I felt something shift inside me. Not a sharp reaction, not even surprise, but a slow, deliberate alignment of pieces that had been scattered just hours before. The missing name, the seating arrangement, the way Vanessa held herself as if she were already in control of something larger than this moment. And I lowered my eyes again, focusing on the program in my hands, the edge now slightly creased where my fingers had pressed against it. And I thought about the house they were referring to, the one Thomas and I had built together over decades. The one where every room held a memory that could not be reduced to a transaction or a timeline. And yet, to them, it seemed to have already become exactly that. Something to be evaluated, something to be handled. And as that realization settled in, I found that the heaviness I had expected to feel never quite arrived. Instead, there was a different kind of clarity, one that came from seeing something exactly as it was without the comfort of denial. And I lifted my head slightly, my gaze moving once more toward the front row, toward Vanessa and Daniel. And for the first time since I had walked into that chapel, I was not looking for acknowledgement. I was not waiting for them to turn toward me, or to include me in whatever story they were telling the world. I was simply watching, and in that quiet act of observation, something inside me began to change. Because grief may have brought me into that room, but understanding was what would carry me out of it. And as the final hymn began, soft voices rising together in a practiced harmony, I realized that whatever they believed they were arranging today, whatever plans had already been set into motion without my knowledge, they were built on one assumption that was about to prove very, very wrong. When the final hymn ended and people began to rise from their seats, the room shifted from quiet reverence into a low hum of polite conversation, chairs sliding softly against the floor, programs being folded and tucked into purses, and I remained seated for just a moment longer, letting the movement pass around me like a current I was not ready to step into yet, because I had learned something in that hour that I could not unsee, and it required a different kind of stillness to understand it fully. And when I finally stood, smoothing my coat with careful hands, I did not move toward the front right away. I did not rush to the casket or to the cluster of people gathering around Vanessa and Daniel. Instead, I stepped into the aisle and allowed others to pass, nodding politely when someone met my eyes, offering a small, composed smile that revealed nothing of what was beginning to settle beneath the surface. And as I made my way forward, I noticed how naturally the space had arranged itself around them, how people formed a gentle line, waiting to speak with Vanessa first, as if she were the center of this loss, as if her connection to Thomas somehow outweighed mine. And I watched as she accepted each condolence with that same measured grace, her voice soft, her expression touched with just enough sadness to be convincing. And Daniel stood beside her, his hand occasionally resting on her back, guiding, supporting, reinforcing the image they had created together. And when I finally reached them, there was a brief pause, a small break in their rhythm, as though my presence had not been accounted for in whatever order they had established. And Vanessa turned to me with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Evelyn," she said, her tone warm but distant, as if she were greeting an acquaintance rather than her husband's mother. And Daniel followed her lead, offering a quick nod, his gaze flickering toward the next person waiting behind me. And for a moment, we stood there, three people connected by a man who was no longer there to hold us together. And I could feel the expectation in the air, the unspoken assumption that I would express gratitude, that I would acknowledge the way they had handled everything, that I would fit neatly into the role they had left for me. But instead, I simply looked at them, really looked, taking in the details I might have ignored before, the way Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly around the folder she held at her side, the edge of it visible beneath the fabric of her coat, the way Daniel avoided meeting my eyes for more than a second at a time. And I realized that whatever they were doing, whatever they had set in motion, it had already moved beyond this room, beyond this day. And I felt something inside me settle into place. Not anger, not even sadness, but a quiet certainty that I would not be carried along by it. And so I inclined my head slightly, offering the same polite acknowledgement I had given to strangers. The service was well organized, I said, my voice calm, even, and Vanessa's smile brightened just a fraction, as if she had received exactly the response she expected. "We wanted to make sure everything was taken care of," she replied. And there it was again, that careful phrasing, that subtle claim of responsibility, of ownership. And Daniel added quickly, "It was easier this way." And I nodded once, as if I agreed, as if I had not spent the last hour noticing how thoroughly I had been removed from every decision that mattered. And then, without waiting for the conversation to extend any further, I stepped aside, allowing the next person to take my place, and I moved toward the casket alone, the polished wood reflecting the soft light from above. And when I stood there, looking down at the man I had loved for most of my life, I did not speak, I did not reach out, because whatever needed to be said between us had already been said long before this moment, in quiet conversations and shared understanding. And instead, I let my gaze drift slightly to the side, where a small table had been set up with a guest book and a few framed photographs. And it was there that I saw it, placed almost casually among the display, another document, partially tucked beneath the guest book, the same cream paper, the same careful lettering. But this one was different. This one was not a program, and I could see just enough of it to recognize the words printed near the top, words that did not belong to a funeral, words that belonged to something else entirely, something legal, something final. And I did not reach for it. I did not draw attention to it. I simply let my eyes rest there for a second longer than necessary before turning away, because I understood now that whatever truth was waiting for me would not reveal itself all at once. It would come in pieces, in small, deliberate moments like this, and I intended to notice every single one of them. The reception hall felt warmer than the chapel, almost uncomfortably so, as if the air itself had been thickened by polite conversations and carefully measured sympathy. And I stepped inside with the same steady pace I had maintained all morning, my eyes adjusting to the softer lighting, The round tables dressed in white linen, the quiet clinking of glassware as people gathered in small circles, and for a moment, it might have looked like any other family gathering, the kind Thomas and I had hosted countless times over the years, except this time, I was not at the center of it. I was moving along the edges, observing, listening, and remembering, because as I watched Vanessa glide from one group to another, her hand occasionally brushing Daniel's arm as she spoke, I found myself thinking about the first time I met her, how she had stood in my kitchen nearly 15 years ago, smiling with that same composed expression, complimenting the house, the garden, the life Thomas and I had built together, and I had welcomed her without hesitation, because that is what you do when your son brings someone into his life. You make space, you open the door, you trust that the family you have created is strong enough to hold one more person, and for a long time, I believed that it was. I believed that the small changes I noticed over the years were just part of the natural shifting that comes with time. The way Sunday dinners became less frequent, the way Daniel's calls grew shorter, the way decisions that once included me began to happen without my knowledge. Each change so subtle it could be explained away on its own. But now, standing in that room, watching Vanessa accept condolences that should have been shared, I could see those moments differently, not as isolated instances, but as pieces of something larger, something that had been forming quietly, patiently, right in front of me. And I moved toward one of the tables, resting my fingers lightly against the back of a chair, allowing myself a moment to breathe, to let the noise of the room settle into something I could sort through. And that was when I heard Daniel's voice again, low but clear enough to carry across the short distance. "We should finalize everything by the end of the week," he said, and Vanessa responded without hesitation. "That is what the attorney recommended. It is cleaner that way." And there was no grief in their voices, no hesitation, only a kind of efficiency that felt out of place in a room meant to honor a life. And I did not turn toward them. I did not interrupt. I simply listened, because listening had always been something I did well, something Thomas used to rely on. "You notice things other people miss," he would tell me. And as I stood there, I realized just how right he had been, because I could see now that whatever was being planned did not begin today. It had been set in motion long before this morning, long before the programs were printed or the seats were arranged, and I closed my eyes briefly, letting a memory surface. Thomas sitting across from me at the kitchen table just a few months ago, his expression serious in a way I had rarely seen, his hand resting over mine as he said, "If anything ever feels off, Evelyn, do not assume it is nothing." And at the time, I had smiled, brushing it aside as worry, as something born from illness and fatigue. But now, those words settled differently, carrying a weight I could not ignore. And when I opened my eyes again, the room looked the same quiet conversations, the same gentle movements, but I no longer saw it as a gathering shaped by loss. I saw it as a stage where something else was unfolding beneath the surface, something I had been expected to overlook, and I straightened slightly, my posture aligning with the clarity that had been building inside me since I first stepped into the chapel, and I understood then that whatever role they had prepared for me, whatever quiet corner they had placed me in, it was based on an assumption I was no longer willing to fulfill, because I was not invisible, I was not unaware. And as I turned my gaze toward Vanessa and Daniel once more, I realized that the story they were telling everyone in that room had one very important flaw. It had been written without me, and that was something I intended to change. The noise of the room softened as people began to settle into their seats, the reception shifting into something more structured, more contained, and I took a place near the edge of one of the tables, not quite part of any group, but close enough to hear what I needed to hear, my hands resting lightly against the smooth linen as I watched the small details unfold, because it was in those details that the truth had always lived, not in the grand gestures or the carefully chosen words, but in the things people assumed no one was paying attention to. And Vanessa, for all her composure, had begun to relax just enough to let those details slip through, her shoulders lowering slightly as she leaned toward Daniel, her voice still quiet, but no longer guarded in the same way it had been earlier. And I could see the folder again, now resting on the table beside her, its edge aligned neatly with the plate in front of her, as if it belonged there, as if it were just another part of the arrangement, and I did not need to see what was inside to understand its importance. because everything about the way she handled it suggested it was not meant to be questioned, only accepted. And Daniel reached for a glass of water, taking a slow sip before speaking. "We should not delay the transfer," he said, his tone measured, practical, and Vanessa nodded, her fingers brushing lightly over the folder as if confirming something only she could see. "The sooner it is finalized, the fewer complications there will be," she replied. And I felt that same quiet clarity settle deeper within me, not as a shock, not even as anger, but as a recognition of something that had already taken shape before I had fully understood it. And I thought again of Thomas, of the way he had always approached decisions, carefully, deliberately, never rushing into anything without considering every angle. And it seemed almost impossible that everything he had built, everything we had shared, could now be reduced to a timeline they were trying to accelerate, as if speed alone could secure whatever outcome they were working toward. And I lowered my gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in thought, allowing the pieces to align in a way that made sense, because there was something about their certainty that did not quite fit, something about the way they spoke as if everything had already been decided, already belonged to them. And that was when another memory surfaced, quiet but precise. Thomas standing by the window in his study, a stack of documents in his hand, looking at me with that same steady expression he used when something mattered. "I have arranged things in a way that protects you," he had said, and I had nodded at the time, trusting him without needing to understand every detail, because that was how our life had worked. We trusted each other to carry what needed to be carried. But now, in this room, surrounded by people who believed the story being presented to them, I realized that trust had not been misplaced. It had simply not been revealed yet. And I lifted my eyes again, focusing once more on Vanessa and Daniel, watching the ease with which they moved through their plan, the quiet confidence that suggested they believed there was nothing left to question, nothing left to challenge. And I wondered, briefly, what they would look like if that certainty were taken away, if the ground beneath them shifted in a way they had not anticipated. And the thought did not bring me satisfaction. It did not feel like revenge. It felt like balance, like something being set back into its proper place. And I reached for the glass of water in front of me, taking a small sip, the coolness grounding me in the present moment, because whatever came next would require more than observation. It would require action, but not the kind they expected, not loud or confrontational, but quiet, deliberate, and precise, the same way Thomas had always handled what mattered most. And as the conversations around me continued, as laughter rose and fell in soft waves, I understood that they believed this was already over, that today marked the closing of something, the final chapter of a story they had rewritten to suit themselves. But I knew better, because I had seen enough, heard enough, remembered enough to understand that what they were calling an ending was, in fact, the point where everything would begin to change, just not in the way they had planned. It was not until I stepped away from the table that someone finally approached me without hesitation, without that careful filtering I had grown used to over the past few hours, and I recognized him immediately, though it took me a moment to place his name. Robert Harris, Thomas's attorney, a man who had been part of our lives for more than 20 years, someone who had sat at our dining table more than once, discussing business matters in low, measured tones while I brought in coffee and listened just enough to understand that what they spoke about carried weight. And now he stood in front of me again, his expression composed but different from the others, less performative, more deliberate, and he inclined his head slightly in greeting. "Evelyn," he said, his voice quiet but steady, and there was something in the way he said my name that made me pause, not out of surprise, but recognition, because it had been a long time since anyone in this room had spoken to me as if I were still central to what was happening, and I returned the gesture with a small nod. "Robert," I replied, and for a moment, we stood there in a silence that felt separate from the rest of the room, as though the noise of the reception had been pushed a few feet away, just enough to give space for something else, something more precise. And he glanced briefly over my shoulder, toward the table where Vanessa and Daniel were still seated, their heads close together, their conversation uninterrupted. And then he looked back at me, his gaze direct. "I was hoping to speak with you," he said, and there was no urgency in his tone, no alarm, just a quiet certainty that this conversation mattered, and I did not ask why. I did not question his timing, because I already understood that whatever he had to say was connected to everything I had been observing, everything I had been piecing together since the morning began, and so I simply nodded once. "Of course," I said, and we moved a few steps away from the main group, toward a quieter corner near the windows where the late afternoon light filtered in, soft and pale, casting long shadows across the floor, and for a moment, he did not speak, as if choosing his words with care, something I had always respected about him. And then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, not the same as the folder Vanessa had been guarding, but something else, something simpler, and he held it between his fingers without handing it to me just yet. "Thomas asked me to give this to you," he said, and I felt a subtle shift inside me, not a jolt, not a surge of emotion, but a quiet alignment, as if a missing piece had finally been placed where it belonged. And I looked at the paper, at the way it was folded, at the care with which it had been kept, and I knew, without needing to open it, that whatever was written there had been meant for me alone, separate from whatever arrangements Vanessa and Daniel believed they were controlling. And Robert continued, his voice low enough that it would not carry beyond the space we occupied. "There are some details you should be aware of before any decisions are made," he said, and the phrasing was careful, neutral, but it carried an implication that was impossible to ignore, because decisions were already being made, just not with me included. And I met his gaze again, steady, composed. "I thought everything had already been arranged," I said, not as a question, but as a statement of what had been presented to me, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Not everything," he replied, and that was all he said. But it was enough to confirm what had been forming in my mind since I first noticed my name missing from that program. Enough to tell me that the story being told in that room was incomplete, and perhaps intentionally so. And he extended the paper toward me then, finally placing it in my hand, and I took it without hesitation, feeling the slight weight of it, the texture of the paper beneath my fingers, and for a brief moment, I considered opening it right there, unfolding whatever truth Thomas had left behind, but instead, I held it closed, because I understood that timing mattered, that whatever was written there would not change simply because I rushed to see it. And I looked past Robert, back toward the room where Vanessa and Daniel continued their quiet coordination, unaware of the small but significant shift that had just occurred, and I realized then that they believed they were ahead, that they had already secured what they came for. But what they did not see, what they could not yet account for, was the fact that I was no longer standing outside of their plans. I was stepping directly into them, and this time, I would not be overlooked. I did not open the paper immediately. Even after Robert stepped away and the quiet space we had shared dissolved back into the low murmur of the room, because something told me that what was inside it was not meant to be rushed, not meant to be consumed in the same careless way everything else had been handled that day, and instead I held it in my hand, feeling its presence, its weight, as I slowly made my way toward the exit of the reception hall, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw attention, but with the same measured pace I had carried myself with all morning, offering polite nods to those who glanced in my direction, acknowledging the occasional soft, "I am so sorry for your loss," with a quiet, "thank you," as if nothing had shifted, as if I were still moving through the same version of the day they all believed in. And yet, with every step, I felt that version slipping further away, replaced by something clearer, sharper, something that did not rely on appearances or assumptions. And when I reached the doors, I paused for just a moment, my hand resting lightly on the handle, and I allowed myself one final look back into the room, at Vanessa and Daniel, still seated together, still speaking in that low, coordinated way, the folder now open between them, its contents partially visible as Vanessa pointed to something on the page, and Daniel leaned in closer, nodding, his expression focused, intent. And I realized then that they had already moved on from the performance of grief, that whatever had been necessary for the ceremony was now complete, and what remained was the execution of something far more practical, far more deliberate. And I stepped outside into the cool air, the shift in temperature immediate, grounding, the late afternoon light stretching across the parking lot in long, quiet lines, and I walked a few steps away from the building before stopping, the sounds from inside fading into a distant hum, replaced by a stillness that felt almost unfamiliar after the weight of the day. And it was there, standing alone beneath a sky that seemed far too calm for everything that had unfolded, that I finally unfolded the paper. My fingers careful, precise, smoothing it open as my eyes moved across. The lines written in Thomas's familiar, steady hand. And the first thing I noticed was not the content, but the tone, because it was unmistakably him, direct, thoughtful, intentional. Evelyn. It began, simple, unadorned, and I felt something settle inside me as I read on. If you are reading this, it means there are conversations happening that you were not included in. And I paused, just for a second, not out of confusion, but recognition, because that was exactly what this day had been. A series of conversations I had been expected to observe, not participate in, and I continued, my eyes moving steadily across the page. I have taken steps to ensure that you are protected, not just in name, but in authority. And there it was again, that word, authority, something I had not yet seen reflected in anything Vanessa or Daniel had said or done. And as I read further, the structure of what Thomas had arranged began to take shape, not in full detail, not yet, but enough to understand that what they believed they were finalizing was only one part of a much larger design, one that did not place me on the sidelines, one that did not reduce my role to something passive or temporary. And I lowered the paper slightly, my gaze lifting toward the horizon as I let that understanding settle, because this was not about surprise, it was not about a sudden reversal. It was about alignment, about seeing clearly what had been put in place long before this moment. And for the first time since the morning began, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible exhale, not of relief, but of certainty, because whatever came next would not be dictated by what they assumed or what they had planned. It would be shaped by what was already written, already secured, and already waiting for me to step into it. And as I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my coat pocket, I realized that the quiet I felt now was not the absence of conflict. It was the presence of control, something I had not needed to assert, because it had been there all along. And as I turned away from the building, leaving behind the room where everything had been arranged without me, I understood that the next time I stepped into that world, it would not be as someone overlooked or dismissed. It would be as someone who knew exactly where she stood, and, more importantly, exactly what was hers. The drive home was quieter than I expected, not because there was no sound, but because everything felt distant, as if the world outside the windshield had been softened, reduced to movement without weight. And I kept both hands on the steering wheel, my posture steady, my thoughts moving with a clarity that had not been there that morning, because grief, I realized, had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape, no longer overwhelming, no longer clouding what I could see, but settling into something more focused, something that allowed me to notice what mattered without distraction. And when I pulled into the driveway of the house Thomas and I had shared for decades, I did not hesitate, I did not sit in the car gathering strength the way I might have a week ago. Instead, I stepped out, closed the door behind me, and walked toward the front entrance with a calm that felt unfamiliar but right. The late afternoon light casting long shadows across the porch, the same porch where Thomas used to sit every evening with his newspaper, commenting on things I half listened to and half ignored. And for a moment, I paused at the door, my hand resting against the handle, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, because I understood that stepping inside now was not the same as it had been before. The house had not changed, but the way it was being viewed, by others and by me, had shifted entirely, and I opened the door and stepped in, the quiet of the interior wrapping around me in a way that felt both familiar and revealing, every object in its place, every room holding the same quiet order Thomas had always preferred. And yet, I could already hear the echoes of the conversations from earlier, the way Vanessa had spoken about evaluation, about timing, about finalizing things quickly, as if this space, this life, could be measured and transferred without consequence. And I moved slowly through the living room, my fingers brushing lightly against the back of a chair, the edge of a table, grounding myself not in memory, but in presence, because this was not something I was losing. This was something I needed to understand fully before anyone else attempted to redefine it. And I reached the study, the one room Thomas had always kept more private than the others, the place where decisions were made, where documents were reviewed, where he had spent hours in quiet concentration. And I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, the soft click marking a boundary between what had been presented to me and what I was now choosing to examine for myself, and I walked to his desk, the surface still neat, still organized, as if he had only stepped away for a moment, and I reached into my coat pocket, retrieving the folded paper he had left for me, placing it carefully on the desk before unfolding it once more, this time reading it more slowly, more deliberately, allowing each line to settle, to connect with what I had observed. There are structures in place that cannot be altered without your consent. The letter continued, and I felt a quiet confirmation in those words, something that aligned perfectly with the certainty I had begun to feel, and I turned slightly, opening the top drawer of the desk, not searching blindly, but with a sense of direction I could not fully explain, and there, beneath a set of neatly arranged folders, I found what I had expected, documents labeled clearly, dated precisely, each one part of a system Thomas had put in place long before any of this had unfolded, and I lifted one of the folders, opening it carefully, my eyes scanning the contents, recognizing enough to understand the structure without needing to decipher every detail. And it became clear that whatever Vanessa and Daniel believed they were finalizing, whatever timeline they had set in motion, it did not override what had already been established here. In this room, in these documents, under conditions they could not simply bypass, and I closed the folder gently, returning it to its place, not out of hesitation, but out of control, because I did not need to act immediately. I did not need to confront or correct anything just yet. What I needed was time, not to understand, but to allow them to continue believing what they believed, to move forward under assumptions that were already beginning to unravel, and I folded the letter once more, placing it back into my coat pocket, and as I stood there in the quiet of that room, I realized that the balance of the situation had already shifted, not visibly, not in a way that anyone else could see, but in a way that mattered, because I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was preparing for what would happen next, and when I finally stepped out of the study, leaving the door slightly ajar behind me, I understood that the house was not just a place filled with memories. It was a foundation, one that had been built with intention, protected with care, and now, it was something I would defend, not with noise or confrontation, but with the same quiet precision that had been used to secure it in the first place. The house remained quiet long after the sun had set, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty, but watchful, as if every room held its breath alongside me, and I moved through it slowly, not out of hesitation, but with intention, allowing myself to see everything clearly now, not as memories tied to loss, but as pieces of something that still belonged to me, something that had not been erased the way Vanessa and Daniel seemed to believe, and I paused by the kitchen window, looking out into the darkened yard where the outline of the old oak tree stood against the night sky, the same tree Thomas had insisted on preserving when we first bought the property, saying it had roots too deep to be moved, and I found myself thinking about that word again, roots, because what we had built together, was not something that could be transferred with a signature or reduced to a timeline decided over a quiet conversation at a reception table. It had depth, structure, protection, and now, finally, I could see it for what it was, not just a life we had lived, but a framework he had secured, one that extended beyond what anyone else had been allowed to see. And I turned away from the window, walking back toward the study, the door still slightly open, a quiet invitation into the place where everything had been set in motion long before today. And as I stepped inside again, I did not go straight to the desk this time. Instead, I stood in the center of the room, letting the stillness settle around me, because I understood now that this was not about reacting quickly. It was about moving correctly, and there was a difference, one that Vanessa and Daniel had not accounted for, because they were operating on urgency, on the assumption that control came from acting first, from finalizing, from closing things before anyone else could intervene. But what they had overlooked was that control, real control, had already been established, quietly, deliberately, and without the need for display. And I walked to the desk once more, opening the drawer with the same calm precision as before, taking out the folder I had examined earlier, and this time, I allowed myself to read more carefully, to trace the structure of what Thomas had arranged, the language clear, intentional, leaving no room for misinterpretation, and it became evident that my role was not secondary, not symbolic, but central, that decisions regarding the house, the accounts, the business interests, all required my direct authorization, not as a courtesy, but as a condition, and I closed the folder gently, placing it back exactly where it had been, because I did not need to hold on to it to understand it. I had already absorbed what mattered, and I reached into my coat pocket, touching the folded letter once more. A small, grounding gesture that reminded me this was not something I had discovered by chance. It was something that had been prepared for me, entrusted to me, and I stepped back from the desk, my posture straight, my movements unhurried, because there was no longer any need to rush, no need to question whether I was included or not. That uncertainty had been replaced by something far more stable, far more certain, and I knew then exactly what I would do next, not in detail, not yet, but in direction, because tomorrow would come, and with it, the conversations. Vanessa and Daniel were so eager to finalize the meetings they believed would secure everything in their favor, and I would be there, not as an afterthought, not as a formality, but as the one person they could not proceed without, and the realization did not bring me satisfaction. It did not feel like a victory. It felt like alignment, like stepping into a position that had always been mine, even when I had not fully seen it. And I walked toward the doorway, pausing just long enough to look back into the room one last time. The desk, the drawers, the quiet order of everything Thomas had left behind. And I understood that nothing in this house had been left unconsidered. Nothing had been left unprotected, and neither had I. And as I turned off the light and stepped into the hallway, closing the door gently behind me, I knew that the version of me they had planned for, the one who would sit quietly, accept what was given, and step aside without question, no longer existed, and the next time I faced them, it would not be as someone they could overlook. It would be as someone who already held the answer to everything they were trying to take.